Welcome to American Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have Casey Fleming, CEO of BLACKOPS Partners. He's going to talk about the great power competition between the United States and China. So Casey, great having you on.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So Casey and I have spoken at events before together. We go back a ways, and I'll tell you, he is one of the few experts on the issue of Chinese subversion in the United States and on the deeper, let's say, battle, the unseen battle with China through various methods of unconventional warfare. So Casey, give us a brief outline of what the issue is with China. Of course, Trump right now is negotiating this big, trade war negotiation with China. But I know you've said this trade war, we've been in it for a long time now, right?
Yeah, quite actually over 3 decades we've been in this in the issue with the Chinese subversion and what the Chinese Communist Party's true intentions are towards the United States, its allies, and the overall West. So when we talk about subversion, it's important to really separate this out, that this really applies to every American citizen, every American company, government agency, military, and so on. And so the issue is, when we hear subversion, it's not something that's in our normal vocabulary. So we kind of discount it and say that must apply to someone else. And really, what subversion is a systematic attempt to overthrow and undermine a government or a political system by another country. And so what's happening is, you mentioned great power competition. If you think about last century, great power competition was World War I, World War II, the different wars, Korea, Vietnam, and eventually the Cold War. This is the new rise, or the new great power competition that we're faced with in this century. So is it World War III? Potentially. Is it well underway? Absolutely. But again, we've got to show that, this is not science fiction. This is something that we're dealing with every day. I remember when I started really looking into this, we were a cybersecurity company way back in the day. And we said, hey, what's really going on? Instead of protecting the perimeter and buying new products and so on, we said, who's behind this? What's really going on? And the more that we dug deep, I got to tell you, my learning curve and my believability curve was pretty much straight up. It's like, wow, they're doing this. Holy cow, they're doing that. So, there's a length of time that the average person has to go through to really absorb this and understand that it's actually true. It is the truth, and so on. So it's really come mainstream now. I'm talking 7, 8 years ago, was my learning curve in really trying to understand who's behind this. And it's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, it's North Korea. But if you think about the 800-pound gorilla, well, the 3,200-pound gorilla is the Chinese Communist Party. So great power competition is here upon us. It is mainstream. It's mainstream because the current White House, is pushing tariffs, which is the key, shot across the bow that we can do to say, hey, enough is enough on economic espionage and your infiltration of our American society, economy, and institutions. So great power competition is among us. Even recently, the Secretary of State came out and talked about great power competition and how our adversaries are not following any of the rules that the global economy set forth 70 years ago. And so the key factor on this new great power competition is that they follow no rules. It's also termed unrestricted warfare, and that's really what we all need to be aware of. But again, we have to make sure that everybody understands this is not science fiction. This is upon us, well upon us, in a very, very mature state today. Right. Back to you.
Yeah, well, so it's an interesting state now where I think that a lot of people don't understand what Trump is doing when it comes to going after China with tariffs. Some of the mainstream news outlets have tried to accuse Trump of, kind of bullying China, that China is the victim in this one, and that, I think that they mentioned maybe a bit of the history of cyber attacks from the Chinese Communist Party, but they don't nearly show the scale of it or why actions like this are both, at least in my analysis, needed and justified. What the Chinese Communist Party has been doing to the United States, what it intends to do to the United States, and how these tariffs, and at least in my analysis, are a functioning part to put an end to the abuse of the United States by the Chinese Communist Party. But what are your thoughts on this, Casey?
Well, you mentioned that the United States is bullying China, and it's quite the opposite. It's quite the other way around. Back in 1986, the Chinese Communist Party came up with Program 863. It's also known as Project 863, and that basically says, and I'll give you my terminology on it, we're going to lie, cheat, and steal, and do everything we absolutely can to be the #1 global superpower at the expense of all other countries, and specifically the United States and its Western allies. So that's really the core of what's going on. So bullying, it's absolutely not. In fact, it's just the United States is starting to fight back against 30-something years of this whole, what is also termed asymmetric warfare, great power competition. It's also termed hybrid warfare, irregular warfare, and so on. And I've got to say that, there's a term out there now today, is that the Chinese are very smart. The Chinese Communist Party are very smart to know that you don't go directly at military to military, face to face with military, and nation to nation. The Chinese are very adept in this asymmetric warfare. They've been doing it for 2,000 years, so they know what they're doing. And that basically says they weaken all different angles asymmetrically, as opposed to confronting a country head on, either military or nation to nation. So from a bullying standpoint, you've got to understand that, and part of this whole asymmetric thing is done in a stealth mode, in a discreet mode. And when they get caught, and we catch spies, or we catch economic espionage, or we catch this, or we catch that, it's all plausible deniability, and we would never do that, and so on. And it's also important to understand that there's a very, very big difference in philosophy between the Chinese Communist Party and American culture. And we want to believe wholeheartedly, and this goes way back to Nixon days and Kissinger, we want to believe that they want to be a democratic society, a Western type of society, and so on. We want to believe so much that they want to be like Americans. And the Chinese Communist Party absolutely does not. Remember, it's a communist regime, and it's done through bullying their people and tremendous at tremendous human cost to keep their people in line. So we could not be more fundamentally, diametrically opposed in our goals and our desires as countries, and where the future is going. One other key note: Americans and the Brits and the Canadians and the French, just think about the football or the soccer teams and so on. We believe in win or lose. If we don't win, we're going to get you next year. The Chinese Communist Party are absolutely opposite than that. It's, live or die. In other words, we must live and you must die, never to compete again. So there's a philosophy there that people need to understand as well. Now, this is a summary that I've learned over the past 8+ years in understanding really what's the core behind this whole cybersecurity thing. And cybersecurity is really just a vector of this much larger plan that is underway, that has been underway now, going on, over 3 decades with the Chinese Communist Party. One last thing: if you are doing business as a company, or you're going to study in China as a student, or even if you're buying products that are made in China, you are partnering with the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party absolutely runs the economy. It runs the strategy for the country. And it completely dominates and drives that entire economy, strategy, and so on. Back to you.
Yeah, well, you made a few interesting points. One is the idea of the Chinese Communist Party systems for asymmetrical warfare. Of course, one of the buzzwords in military now is hybrid warfare, which is just a fancy way of saying taking various forms of tactics and using them in conjunction with each other. And as some people have commented, well, hybrid warfare is such a loose term, you could say anything is warfare. And that's absolutely correct. For the Chinese Communist Party, anything and everything is warfare. If if you read their book, it's by two Chinese colonels called Unrestricted Warfare, they talk about war without morals. And they talk about how every single part of the state should be used as a weapon to achieve the goals of the Communist Party, the main target being the United States. And they lay out three different tiers of war, or three different categories of warfare. There's non-military, trans-military, and military. Non-military could be business warfare, economic warfare, which business is being targeting individual companies, economic being targeting the GDP of a country. Transaction warfare, targeting transactions in process. Psychological warfare, changing the way people interpret information. Media warfare, controlling outlets of information. These are all directly listed in this doctrine. Trans-military would be things like cyber attacks. And and then the military concepts are mostly asymmetrical as well. Things like terrorist attacks, biological weapons. The Chinese Communist Party has what it calls the assassin's mace weapons. This is various systems for surprise attack meant to eliminate the enablers of a high-tech adversary. So anti-satellite weapons, electromagnetic pulse to shut off electronic equipment, these kinds of things. But we talk about cybersecurity. A lot of people get lost in cybersecurity by just thinking cybersecurity is limited to cyber, where in reality, when you were dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, cyber and human go hand in hand. In fact, a lot of times even the cyber attacks are just smoke screens to give plausible deniability to hackers or to physical spies operating within the facility. I know, Casey, you're one of the few experts on this topic, right? Your company, you've of course investigated issues like this. Could you talk about how cyber overlaps with, especially when it comes to the Chinese threat actors, how it overlaps with human intelligence threats?
They're absolutely interlinked. They're parallel efforts, and they dovetail each other. So the cyber piece of it is using the network or using the internet to access information, data, economic espionage, and so on. So, but it also has another strong component, which, as you mentioned, the human aspect. And the human aspect is infiltration through all the aspects of our society and our economy, which is the business side, which is the private sector, which drives our economy, and also our universities. At one point, a couple of years ago, we were at 405,000 Chinese students in U.S. universities. And then you've got Chinese Confucius Institutes, you've got Chinese Confucius classrooms in U.S. middle schools, and so on. So
which are run by the Chinese Communist Party.
Of infiltration. Yeah. Pardon me?
I say which are run by the Chinese Communist Party. And it should be noted too that while we can't say every Chinese student's a Chinese spy, the Chinese Communist Party will approach many of them to try to get them to spy, especially if they're going into an area that would serve the interests of the state.
Yeah. And in fact, our intelligence shows that the Chinese Communist Party believes that every one of those students is an asset that can be tapped at any time for covert missions.
Yeah. So, and on that note too, yeah, the Chinese student and scholar associations are directly controlled by the consulates, oftentimes even financed by them, even on the books. And they'll groom students to get into, say, key positions of government, key industries, and so on. They have programs like the Torch program, which is an economic theft program to groom people within different professions and get them to either return to China with the knowledge or information they've gained or stolen, or to serve in place, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And and I think also it's an important thing to note too that you mentioned that how the Chinese Communist Party regards overseas Chinese. One of the main systems for subversion in the West, and subversion is infiltration of all the institutions that make a country function. It could be business, media, government, military, you name it. Every single institution that makes a country tick, they infiltrate it. They get into it, and if you can get a single person within an area of influence in that company or institution, you can begin controlling it in different ways. Even if it's an advisory position, you can start changing the policies of it. The Chinese Communist Party, through its United Front department, actively goes and does these operations. And one characteristic of the United Front Department is that it regards not only all overseas Chinese as part of the Chinese Communist Party, but even second and third generation Chinese citizens. And this should be clear. This is not, it's a lot of race-based espionage, but it's also a major source of human rights abuse abroad, because the Chinese Communist Party uses this to monitor and punish Chinese people living abroad who refuse to play along with it. And this is why you have a lot of people in Chinese communities in the United States, Canada, Australia, you name it, who are afraid of speaking out against the Communist Party because they fear for their own safety or the safety of their families because of this system. So Casey, I'm curious, talking about subversion and how big this picture is and how it ties into economic theft. What are your thoughts on this?
Economic theft is part of this whole espionage thing. You know, when I was studying our adversary and our company was studying our adversary, you have to really know your adversary. And what the Chinese Communist Party says is that espionage is 1,000 grains of sand. And when they view it that way, they say, we don't want everything all at once. We're going to do it over time in small quantities, and eventually you've got 1,000 grains of sand. And you have to understand that methodology and that approach. So espionage and economic espionage is a fundamental piece because, number one, it's powerful. It's extremely powerful. And it's protected at all costs by the Chinese Communist parties. And the reason it's powerful is because, think about this, an American company spends 7 years developing a product, a cancer drug, a computer chip, a special chemical, you name it. Innovation is what powers and has powered our economy. So we say we spend 7 or 10 years developing it in time. Then we spend $2, $3, $4, $5 billion. Well, if it's stolen, if that economic innovation or intellectual property is stolen, then not only do you erase the time requirement, you also erase the funding requirement, and then you use that to power your economy. And then you sell it back to whoever you stole it from. In this case, it's always the United States, or mostly the United States. And you sell it back to those customers, in other words, our customers, at 50 cents on the dollar. So it's if your company's big enough, you can absorb that over time, but over time you can't. You can absorb one hit like that. You can absorb a few hits. A small company, there's many examples of it. Small companies can't absorb it, and they have a very difficult time surviving. And it's survival is an issue, and that is really what the key factor is. One point I'll make to you is that in this whole great power competition, remember I mentioned World War I, World War II, and the Cold War last century. That's the war that we're in this century, and there's a saying in our industry and in our company that American companies, remember this whole asymmetric surround thing and attack from all different angles as opposed to a direct frontal attack militarily. American companies are on the front lines in the gray zone between peace and war. And that's the key factor. When we go out and talk to companies, as well as military, as well as Congress, the Senate, and universities, and so on, it takes a while for this to sink in. And they're starting to understand it now, because I mentioned earlier that they're in the mainstream. They're feeling it in the mainstream. Our Secretary of State, our Vice President of the country are all talking about great power competition and how our adversaries follow no rules. So they understand something is afoot, and they need this explanation to understand really what this is, the strategy behind it. The strategy is the asymmetrical hybrid warfare, short asymmetric warfare. That's the textbook term. That's the strategy that our adversaries use. The condition or the theater that we're playing in is great power competition.
Great. And Casey, we just have a couple minutes left. Any closing thoughts in terms of why the average person should care about, what we're seeing right now between the United States and China? How does this affect, the average Joe, and how does this affect me, right? What would you say?
That's really a great point, because in the past you say, well, this is an issue between countries. So our military is going to and our government's going to protect us. And as I just explained, that's not the case because they're attacking each individual person. They're stealing our identities. They're stealing our personal information. They're stealing our economic investments in our economy that power our national security and power our military and power actually and eventually power our way of life that we all enjoy. So you have to understand that it's much like back in the 80s and 90s when we had sexual harassment training and we had diversity training. We now have to have digital training. We have to have data training, and we have to have this whole great power training and so on. And unfortunately, it's nice to think that we're not at war, but we actually are. And I was asked this a while back. Why do you call it warfare, and how can you call it warfare? Because nobody's dying that we're seeing. And I answered that question directly and said, when our adversary calls it warfare, then we call it what our adversary calls it. And our adversary clearly calls this through our intelligence and through our intelligence partners. Our adversaries clearly call this warfare. And it's, like I said, the textbook term is asymmetric warfare. So it affects all of our current lives, our way of life, all the way through our children, our grandchildren, and so on. And remember, our adversary thinks on 50 and 100-year horizons, and we as Americans think on quarterly horizons and quarterly earnings with Wall Street and so on. So it affects all of us, and it's coming mainstream. So all I would say is pay attention to the news. If you've watched this program through, now you're educated on this subject, and be alert. And when you see these news bites coming through, understand it's part of a bigger picture.
Casey Fleming, thanks for being on the show, and I have to get you on again sometime.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.